Okay. We're going to do the Webster reading first, then we'll do roll, then we'll finish up with the feet. Thermocline of truth. As I mentioned 30 years ago, it was actually just exactly 30 years ago. Sandra and I were living in Santa Cruz. I got a contract programming job at Apple, and was brought in. I've mentioned this briefly, that they bought this multimedia software from a third-party company, and I had to go in and fix it. And it was one where I had to end up rewriting this entire routine because it was so badly written. But one of the things I noticed there, my time at Apple, now I had written for Byte and Macworld magazine for several years. I was very familiar with Apple as a I was very familiar with Apple as a major entity in personal computing. It reviewed a lot of Apple products and so on. So it was very interesting actually working inside of Apple. And one of the things I noticed during my 3 or 4 months there was that there was sort of this upper management layer at the top of Apple, and there was sort of a middle upper management layer, and there was everyone working below that layer. And stuff would come down from above, but none of the problems which I saw, not just in the team I was working with, but all through the various divisions that I had to interact with, wasn't getting back up. Apple thought everything was very hunky-dory up at top management, whereas down in the trenches it was very clear it wasn't hunky-dory. And a few years later, when I started doing reviews of troubled IT projects, I found this was a very common phenomenon. Now the idea was that of a thermocline, and I've talked about thermoclines here, haven't I? Yeah. Okay. If you've ever swum in a lake, you know, you have like a foot of warm water and then it's ice cold. Starting to cool down. That's a thermocline, okay? Well, what you have on many software projects in many organizations is a thermocline of truth. A point at which bad news is not making its way back up to the top. There are a number of reasons for this. First, you have this lack. Remember we talked about metrics a week or two ago? Part of it is that in the trenches, even if you don't have metrics, you typically have an idea of whether or not the project's going well. Just based on day-to-day progress, you know, what new features are not coming online, and so on. But without objective metrics that upper management can simply run and see, they have to rely on the reporting that comes up. Now, engineers are often part of the problem. This is the, oh, I'll just work a few extra nights and weekends and we'll get this fixed. So sometimes we are optimists and we tend to give the most optimistic estimate. We don't like saying, oh yeah, it's going to be 6 more months till we have this done. At some point you can have self-protection on the part of managers. You have some manager at a certain level who's getting reports from those below him that there's real problems, but he's not willing to push that upstairs. And quite frankly, in a lot of organizations, top management tends to reward good news and punish bad news. Now, one of my favorite thermocline stories has to do Fannie Mae. I was there, this was back in the mid-90s. OSG, we had about 25 consultants in there, and I was overall 25 consultants, and I worked directly with Carol Teasley, who's VP of Object Technology. I'm sorry?
I'm just curious, is Fannie Mae related to Sallie Mae?
Yep, they're all government entities set up for loans. So this is, Fannie Mae was created by the government. Basically, it's actually a quasi-private organization, had publicly traded shares until they got into a big accounting scandal and got delisted. But basically, Fannie Mae would buy up mortgages from banks. So the bank was no longer carrying the mortgage, and the bank had money now to make new mortgages. Fannie Mae would then service the mortgage, and they would create what are called mortgage-backed securities, and they would put these out on Wall Street and get investors to give them money so they could buy more mortgages, and so on and so forth. Anyway, Carol Teasley, who I was basically directly reporting to in Fannie Mae, was given year 2000 remediation responsibilities for Fannie Mae. And she looked at me and said, you know, misery loves company, you're going to have to work on this too. Which is how I ended up testifying before Congress 3 times. That's a whole other story. Anyway, but their goal was to have all their internal systems at Fannie Mae remediated, all the Y2K problems done by the end of 1998. And there were about 30 internal groups or divisions that had to report on this. And they used a classic green, yellow, red reporting structure to her. And so every week she'd get these reports, and the reports were all green with a few yellows sprinkled in there, no reds. And this continued until the first week of December 1998. We're at the magic, remember the magic 3 weeks before the deadline? Okay. We're at 3 weeks before the deadline. And she goes to the weekly meeting, and suddenly everything is yellow or red. And she looks around the room and says, okay, tell me what you know now that you didn't know a week ago. And they had no good answers. They had basically been shining on the actual progress being made until it reached a point where they could no longer hide it. And that's usually what you have with the thermocline, is that the truth cutoff, as you get closer to an actual shipping deadline, keeps moving farther and farther up the management chain. I think that's part of the reason for the magic 3-week number there. As I say there. Now, how do you avoid it? Managers have to welcome bad news, and engineers have to be willing to give it. That's a lot easier said than done. Furthermore, you have to reward that honesty. Now, when I go in, when I'm brought into a company to review a troubled project, my whole technique is to pierce the thermocline. Usually the first thing I do is I spend several days talking to people at all levels, and particularly those in the trenches. And I talk to a lot of people, so I'm not getting just one person's personal opinion or gripes, and usually, frankly, within 3 or 4 days, I know exactly what the problems are, because I've now heard it from a dozen different people at different positions. And I can usually tell you right where the thermocline is, too. Where the bad news is being halted on its way up to the top. Yes?
One of your other articles you mentioned about how engineers hire people that are better than them, or something about
Oh, that's actually an old Steve Jobs quote. A
Yeah.
people hire A people, B people hire C people.
Yeah. So would you say A engineers do they still have this same kind of thing where they either don't want to say that they're behind, or they're just so good that they're actually never behind?
Well, having learned through painful experience, again, a lot of my outspokenness comes from my own misjudgments at pages, which is why I turn to the person who stands up on the desk and waves his arms and says, no, this is all going to go south, and here are the reasons why. Really good engineers will usually be very honest. And if there are problems, they will say, here are the problems, this is what it is. Sometimes, as happened at Airing, where I was told to shut up an architect. I then, as a consultant, had the luxury of coming back, as I mentioned, several weeks later and dusting off my same memo of all the risks and saying, look, 12 of the 13 risks I told you about have all come to pass. And that project eventually died, but that was after they already let me go as a consultant. Part of it is good, even if people above you don't want to hear it, put it in writing. With the Airing situation, I wrote an email. And I was able to go back to the email and say, look, I told you this back at the start of December. This is what's happening. Yeah.
So I can see very clearly how you can discourage honesty, but how do you reward it?
And it takes management saying, I want to know the truth, where do we stand? And making sure there are no repercussions. There is a whole mindset in one school of management that abuse and threats are effective motivations. And that's still true with a lot of managers. It's like, we'll just keep the pressure on them, and we're just gonna make them work their butts off. We're not gonna give them any excuses, and they'll come through somehow. It's stupid, but it's out there. There was another hand up over here. I mean, rewarding it is saying, I want to know. Actually, what a good manager would do, if I were the CIO of a company, I would regularly go down in the trenches and do one-on-one private interviews with all the engineers on the lower level, say, how are things going really? That's what I would do, because I would then know exactly how the projects were going.
You'd be nervous about you.
Not necessarily. If you've established a good track record of saying, yeah, I can talk to him and tell him anything, and he's actually happy to hear it. It's when you get the browbeating from middle managers, or they're actually lying or distorting. In fact, one of the articles we talked about, there was a very literal thermocline there. Have any of you experienced this yourselves? Have any of you actually seen this thing where you're down in the trenches, you know things aren't good, but upper management seems to be unaware of it? Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't software. Actually, a few years ago, I was working in customer service, and upper management was completely unaware of why they were losing customers, but everybody talking to them knew. Eventually, they just created a simple question and answer site for customer support to ask questions to engineers, and things improved very quickly.
Yeah. And yes, this syndrome is not unique to IT. This is pretty much what you get on any sort of management hierarchy. Yeah.
So at my company right now, they keep doing these surveys because the upper management doesn't really know what's going on, so they keep like saying, hey, we're gonna do this company survey to like find out how everyone feels about this project or this, and then it never goes anywhere. We just keep getting these surveys, and it's not really, it doesn't really help at all. So
Which points out another good thing. They can give lip service to we really want to know. But the question is, are they willing to act upon it? Are they willing to actually slip deadlines or say, oops, we clearly have something dysfunctional in this project? Yeah.
I have a different experience. It's like not really coding related. It's about coworker.
Mhm.
Like when I was on my internship, there was one guy in my team. He did like nothing. Like amount of work he's done and the amount of like salary he got paid, like his hourly rate is like super high. But I don't think our manager knows, because our manager doesn't really
Doesn't know how to evaluate. Doesn't know he's doing that.
Yeah, and
Oh, yeah.
because we're in a team, so the rest three of us was doing all the work, and I think he just tagged along.
Oh yes, that happens too.
So what do we do? Like,
Well, that's a good question. A good manager will figure that out. The problems with a negligent or bad manager is they won't want to hear it. This may be their favorite programmer, and so they're happy just to sort of bask in the glow of what this person is doing, or supposedly doing, even though this person's not doing anything at all. That's one of those situations where you can bring up the manager and say so-and-so isn't really doing anything. But the problem, and trust me, this is one of the root reasons why IT is so difficult to manage. If you don't have a manager who understands technology enough to make that evaluation, himself or herself, then it becomes I say this, he says this, and a manager has no way to distinguish between the two. And this is a real problem you get into when you have a non-technical management over a technical group. Frankly, I run into this as an expert witness. I'm an expert witness for one side, they have someone who's an expert witness for the other side, they both have credentials. I say X, the other person says Y, and the judge or the jury struggles to try and figure out which of us actually knows what we're talking about, who's being honest. You have the same problem as managed, yeah.
I experienced that where I was like basically the client because it was me reporting to like the head of the company. And it's kind of like, in 1 minute or less, how's it going? In front of everyone in the company. It's just like, I didn't even know what to report most times.
Anatomy of a Runaway IT Project. If you didn't, I suggest you go read this article. This is me, my third time reviewing the same project in 3 years. A large finance company that's remained nameless. And this third time, I mean, we had some senior developers, architect mentors, and so on in on the project, but it's mostly being run by the company itself. And our people, I was working for a consulting firm, our people were coming back to me and saying, this project is just so screwed up, you wouldn't believe it. And of course, I'd already reviewed it twice, and this was my third time, and I wrote a very, very frank memo. I've got it, it's in this article, go read it. The names are all changed, protect the guilty. And this project was killed a year after my review, and the executive VP over the project was fired. The company wasted 4 or 5 years and a few tens of millions of dollars on this project, even though the problems have been pointed out multiple times. Do not defer the difficult. I've talked about this a number of times. So I assume you read the article, but this has been a theme I've been telling you guys all along. One of the biggest causes of software failures is you do all the low-hanging fruit. You do all the easy stuff. You prototype the interface. You get this working. And in your mind, you're pushing off all the hard problems. And then you get to a point where you can't push them off anymore, and you start to tackle them, and they turn out to be a lot harder than you thought, as per armor. You discover things you didn't know. And in some cases, you have made design and implementation decisions such that you now have some number of hard problems where the solutions are mutually incompatible. And you've got to unroll stuff and say we've got to go back and do this in a different way in order to accommodate these problems. Yes?
It would seem to me like there's risk the other way though as well. Like you solve the hard problem and you're afraid to change it even when the easy problems require it.
Yeah, but it's usually easier to change the hard solution for an easy problem, or you can. I mean, this gets back to, I think I've told you guys the story that the pages, we were well along, and we were trying to push towards, this was last year, trying to push towards project completion. And our CEO comes to me and said, can we do rotating headlines? And I buried my face in my hand and said, no, Larry, we can't do rotating headlines. I said, why not? We had them in Xerox Ventura. I said, Larry, that was a design decision made like 2 years ago. That the underlying structure and architecture of the product as it currently stands will not allow for arbitrary rotation of headlines. I said, we would have to go back and break a lot of stuff and rework it and rebuild it to put that one feature in. And he asked me about 3 more times and then he dropped it. I think he finally decided I wasn't just trying to avoid it. Yes?
It seems to me like some things, like prototyping, like it doesn't hurt to do that first, but to realize that you're not nearly as far as you might be.
Oh yeah. And the problem is you, and I've said this before, one of the real dangers with prototyping is you know you're not very far along, but management looks at it and says, oh, hey, you're almost done. It's like, no, this is all smoke and mirrors. This is not anywhere close to being done. But look, you've got menus and windows, and I can pop this down, and you do some flashy things on the screen. It is a real problem. Okay, that's that. Let's call roll. Let's see. Yeah, we may get out of here a little early today. I know you all love coming here. Listening to me talk to you. But yes, there's even more we like leaving here. I appreciate that. Honesty is a good thing. Okay.
You want to stop your video?
I've got one more slide. All right, guys, quiet. Remember, I've reorganized the roll here so that and I literally can't read this. No. Reorganize it by teams. And hopefully I have, if I mistyped or miswrote any, yes.
Did you want the recorder to keep rolling?
Oh, thank you. No, I didn't. I appreciate